Hi, good morning, everyone. Excited to see everyone today. Looks like we got a few folks still joining us. I'll give folks a second to come in and get settled. Welcome to the EPAC meeting. I'm going to put some of our housekeeping norms on the slide while folks are joining us. And I love to see the good morning greetings in the chat. All right, everyone. Well, I hope everyone is staying warm and is safe and has power and water and all the good things. I know every time we get a winter storm around this time of year, we all have feelings, but it is nice to be inside and cozy and warm, even if all the trees are covered in ice still. But hope everyone's safe and glad we're able to come together virtually today to meet as the Educator Preparation Advisory Committee. Really excited with our topics for discussion today to get your feedback and input on some really important decisions that the EPAC will be making moving forward. A few reminders as we get started. I'm sure that these are all old hat by now, but just a few housekeeping reminders. The meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded at the conclusion of the meeting. We appreciate Dr. Ward's feedback around ensuring that this meeting is transparent and open and accessible to those who want to learn more about the great discussions that you all engage in as a committee. And so we are working to ensure that we've got that timely upload of this recording to our website. In addition, again, we ask that you mute your microphone unless you're speaking. And then when we're in our whole group, because we are a big group, we do ask that folks raise their hand to be able to share out with the group overall. And then we appreciate being able to see all of your faces and engage in. We can't be together in person. It's great to be able to see folks' faces in this virtual environment. And so we do ask that you leave your camera on if possible. With that, I want to jump into our agenda for the day today. So we have 3 core topics that we'd like to discuss with you all as the EPAC today. And carry forward into future conversations as well. First, we've been engaging with the problem of practice recently around the reading academies. We thought this is a perfect opportunity to circle back to this group, representatives from both EPP leadership, LEA leadership, our classroom educators, our community members, to really get your diverse perspectives on some future considerations related to the reading academies. Second, we know that the EPAC has engaged in a rich and robust discussion related to the implementation of the EdTPA as a performance assessment for certification, and that there's been discussion with the board around the need to develop criteria and a process for an alternative performance assessment to the EdTPA. And so we'd like to bring that discussion to you all today. And then finally, we know that we've been engaged in ongoing discussions together as a committee around the development of an effective preparation framework. And today we would like the opportunity to touch base with you all around the ask that we made at our last EPAC meeting and share a little bit more in terms of guidance and directions. And then lastly, we will have an opportunity to open up for member questions. Please feel free to leverage the chat throughout the meeting today. If there's questions that we can address in the moment, we will. Otherwise, we may hold some questions for the end as well. But first today, I wanted to start with an initial discussion around the reading academies. Recognize that the reading academies was a statutory requirement integrated into House Bill 3 out of the legislative session before the last legislative session, so the 86th session. And the reading academies are required for all educators who teach in grades K through 3. And this requirement was implemented along the same timeline as the Science of Teaching Reading requirement. So the certification exam, the Science of Teaching Reading exam, was implemented along that same pathway. We recognize that based upon the requirements of the legislation, teachers are required to, from this point forward, if they are seeking certification in a certification category that impacts candidates in grades EC through 6, that they are required to demonstrate mastery on the STR exam. And those candidates, once teachers of record, are then also required to take the reading academies. And there's been some really great lessons learned in implementation of both the Science of Teaching Reading exam requirement and the Reading Academies requirement over the course of the past few years. And there's been some feedback in the field that we'd love to bring to this group to get some of your initial reflections, thoughts, and really leverage your expertise from your diverse roles to really help inform some considerations moving forward. So we'll name two prominent pieces of feedback that we've heard often from folks in K-12 and from our preparation programs over the course of STR exam and Reading Academies implementation. First, we've heard with full implementation of the STR exam, which we know went live January 1, 2021, there's an acknowledgement that candidates have now demonstrated mastery of some of the competencies that are also now covered under the Reading Academies. And so there's been a question in the field, can new teachers who have that, for example, core subjects with STR EC6 certificate, who have that stamp that they've demonstrated mastery of some of these competencies, be given credit for having demonstrated this proficiency once they enter the role as a teacher of record? That's one wondering that's been in the field. Another wondering that we've heard from the field was around opportunities or pathways for new teachers to receive Reading Academies training during pre-service so that they have that training completed once they're hired. And what we've heard from K-12 systems is they often harken back to principal preparation training, where many principal programs across the state have candidates complete T-test training while they're in their principal preparation program. So when that candidate's hired as a principal, they already have that training in their toolkit. So those are two big wonderings that we've heard, both from K-12 and then also from our preparation programs. And so as we've been contemplating these areas of feedback and thinking about opportunities for continuous improvement, we wanted to bring to you all two potential considerations that are under discussion now to really get your perspective, your thoughts, your feedback, and really primarily focusing on the second question, what could be the potential benefits or unintended consequences of these approaches? So the first potential recommendation, particularly aligned to that first piece of feedback that we've received in the field, is the potential to consider a crosswalk of the STR exam and the Reading Academies to potentially provide an expedited Reading Academies training that would remove content that was covered by the STR exam. So envision, we've already engaged in pretty extensive crosswalking of the STR exam and Reading Academies, but determining those competencies that candidates have already demonstrated mastery of with the STR exam, and therefore creating potentially a more streamlined or expedited version of the Reading Academies that did not require candidates to again demonstrate mastery of those competencies. We think that there are definitely some potential benefits to the field, and there could be some unintended consequences. So wanted to let that sit with this group for a second and see, one, are there additional clarifying questions or thoughts or initial feedback? And then two, would love to hear from folks about potential benefits or unintended consequences. Dr. Sterling?
I just had a clarifying question. I know anyone in like the EC through 6, right, has to take the STR exam, and then is it the secondary, like 4 through 8, also ELA teachers? So that was my first question. Who actually is mandated, I can't remember, to take the STR? And then I'll yeah.
Absolutely. So that's a great question, Dr. Sterling. So there are 5 impacted certificates, and those impact our educators who teach reading at the EC through 6 level. So the certificates that are impacted for the purpose of the STR exam are the early childhood certification exam, the core subjects with STR EC6, the core subjects with STR 4 through 8, and then the ELAR 4 through 8 exam, and then the ELAR social studies 4 through 8 exam are the impacted certification fields. That all of those fields are required to take the STR exam along with their content pedagogy exam.
Okay, and I guess there's two, sorry, I have two more questions. So for those teachers already in the field, they have to go back and take this test, correct?
So any teacher who already is certified is not required to go back and take the science of teaching reading exam. Okay. So if I already had a core subjects with a core subjects EC6 cert, I don't have to go back and take the STR exam. But if I'm teaching in grades K through 3, I am required to take the Reading Academies training.
Okay, so I guess my thing would be, wouldn't it, if there is crossover, if it's mandatory that they take that STR exam, why would they have to then take the Reading Academies at the same time if we know that they are the same information?
So that's a great question. So we'll name that while some of the content and some of the competencies overlap, what we often talk about with the science teaching reading exam into the Reading Academies is thinking about the content of the science of teaching reading exam as those foundational competencies that a teacher needs to demonstrate in order to really become a teacher of record and begin early literacy instruction with their students. The Reading Academy is really sort of picks up that baton for the most part and continues on in an educator's development, really has them demonstrate meaningfully the application of those skills within their classroom context, and really moves them from a beginning foundational mastery of the science teaching reading into really a highly functional practitioner of the science teaching reading moving forward. So there's a progression of knowledge and skills, but we do recognize that there are some skills that do overlap. And so is there an opportunity for those competencies that do currently overlap to leverage an opportunity to streamline some of that content?
Okay, thank you. That helped, like just my thinking.
Absolutely. Holly, questions, thoughts, feedback?
Yes, thank you very much. This has, so, both of these requirements, the Reading Academies and the STR exam, were part of a very large comprehensive bill. And, as often is the case when you have sort of all these different cooks in the kitchen, someone on one end of the kitchen may not realize what someone on the other end of the kitchen is doing. And so, this was a huge bill, and there were a lot of different requirements in this bill. And I'm not sure that there was necessarily a cohesive understanding of how all the pieces work together. So this issue of the STR exam and the Reading Academies has sort of bubbled around in the field now that both those requirements are simultaneously in place. And this idea of reducing, or for lack of a better word, allowing teachers who are already, have already demonstrated much of what's being taught in the Reading Academies to so-called clep out of them or get a shorter, be able to engage in a shorter version of them has long been a discussion in the field. So I think that this is timely. I think it would be very helpful. I think that the sort of layering on of these requirements for teachers in the middle of a pandemic has been particularly burdensome. And anything we can do to alleviate that layering on would be really helpful. One thing I will say is that the commissioner, I guess, and we probably need to clarify this, has, are there any rules on the Reading Academies? I don't think there are yet, but the commissioner apparently has some authority over implementation because there are a series of FAQs that allow folks who have completed, I forget, there's some group of teachers that completed some kind of reading practices training that are able to be exempt from the Reading Academies now. So the commissioner has authority to exempt certain people, I guess. So in that regard, that's helpful. But the sort of the broader issue here is really the burdensome of the reading academies. The construct of them is such that they are 11 months long. And if you don't complete it in 11 months, you have to start all over again, which is very problematic. We're hearing a lot from our members in the field that they are struggling to get the 80 hours done on top of, covering for their colleagues who are out or other absences. And so we've actually raised with TEA and others the idea of allowing teachers who cannot complete the reading academies in the allotted 11 months to be able to instead of having to take the whole thing over again, be able to pick up where they left off and be able to complete a shorter version. So I know that's broader than this discussion, but it kind of dovetails with it. And we are hoping that there'll be some attention paid to making things less burdensome for our educators out there.
I appreciate that context and feedback, Holly, and recognize that some of that falls within the scope of sort of like our collective work together, and some of it's a little bit outside. But I will name that I appreciate the feedback that 100% we're looking at where are those opportunities to streamline, ensure that we're recognizing where our teacher candidates have demonstrated their competency, and acknowledging that while still ensuring that they're continuing to demonstrate those additional skills that the legislature required. But are there ways to streamline is certainly top of mind for us. Andrea, additional thoughts or questions on your end?
Yeah. Thank you for this discussion. We conducted a survey in December of our members on the reading academies, and I'd be happy to share that with you. But this was something that we tried to address. We only had like 85 of our almost 1,000 respondents who had done the STR and then a reading academy, but they did talk about how the content was a little bit different. And so I think that supports what you're talking about. But at the same time, I think like the idea of testing out of certain competencies within like certain modules or whatever, however it's broken down, would be really beneficial for them. And so based on that, I do have a clarifying question for you. Just thinking about the burden on a new educator, would they be required to complete the reading academy in their first year of teaching?
So this might be one of those times in which I would need to maybe phone a friend and get some additional clarification from the field. Again, here we're just less about the reading academies policy and ways that we could actually just streamline that training, recognizing our area of oversight, which is over the science of teaching reading exam. But certainly I can circle back with that team and share some updated information to you all as they continue to provide. I think as Holly mentioned, there's FAQs and additional guidance that goes out to the broader community. So I'm happy to follow up and share that information with you, Andrea.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because that just goes to my thinking about, one of the potential benefits would be they're so burdened in that first year of teaching and then having to do a training, which our members said actually a lot of them, it took them like over 120 hours to complete. That's something that just feels impossible to me thinking back to when I was a new teacher. So being able to test out of those competencies would be good for not only people who took the STR, but veteran teachers, teachers who have masters in reading, things like that. And then other feedback that we've gotten from the field is that they really do think that this content is so much like a college course that it would fit better within the EPP. And so my question is, I think you spoke to this a little bit, but why wouldn't all of the content be covered in the EPP? If that's something you want them to know, then why wouldn't they learn all of it then?
Andrea, you're giving a good preview of my next slide. So I'll name, we have some of the similar thoughts. So just know that that is definitely on the docket for us to discuss just next.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thanks. Liz, thoughts, feedback, considerations from your perspective?
Sure, yeah, so I want to chime in on the EPP side. The first question I have is, what's the timeline for making a decision about how to move forward with whatever recommendation about this is?
Great question, Liz. So again, these are in early discussions, and again, our first step is to really get input and feedback from the field to determine, is this a viable pathway? are there things that we need to be taking into consideration before we move forward with any additional policy discussions and or just updates to the training content itself. So I can't give you a direct update at the moment on timeline here. Again, we're just trying to solicit input, feedback early in the process as we begin to anticipate if there's any updates to the training. And again, this is a cross-functional process across multiple teams at the agency.
Yeah, so I think that that's an important piece because while I'm an EPP faculty member, my expertise is in math and science. I mean, I know about, you know, some of the reading academies, but, you know, this, I've heard, you know, it's supposedly 80 hours, but as Andrea just said, it takes 120 plus hours. You know, a standard course at a university is 45 contact hours. So, you know, it's not just as simple as necessarily let's add it to the EPP curriculum. And I'm also a little bit concerned about the analogy of the T-test training, because the T-test training, at least the version that I went through, was 3 8-hour days of training plus the certification exam. That's a vast difference from 180 to, I mean, 80 to 120 hours versus that. So I just want to bring that up from the EPP standpoint.
So Liz, I really appreciate that feedback. I think that that's a little bit more applicable to the next discussion, which is related to potential integration of reading academies into coursework. I think here we're just talking about opportunities to streamline the actual reading academies themselves to better align where candidates have already demonstrated mastery. So would appreciate that. We can definitely circle back there on the next slide, but want to give folks an opportunity to further react here. Emil, additional thoughts, questions, reactions on your end?
Yeah, since I am a teacher and I am actually in the middle of the reading academies, I can speak to this. It is a burden, and 120 hours is being actually nice to the reading academies. I think the information is quite valuable, but I did not, and that's what I asked in the chats, I did not know that if you already had the test, you also had to take the reading academies, because on the other side is the opposite, because you don't have to take the test, you had to take the reading academies for those of us who were before. So I have zero idea how, I did not know that that was happening. So my comment is that we most definitely need to streamline this, because the burden on new teachers, or if they're going to give them 2 years, because of course there's a deadline for the reading academies that is next year for those of us who have been in the field already. So I think there has to be some understanding that there is a connection between them, so the burden is much less. I don't know if once you do the mixing of what is in the STR exam and what is in the reading academy, and it will diminish the amount of work. But I have here that is 12 modules. I have 12 months to finish it. Some modules are 9 hours. So in itself, for a new teacher who paid a whole bunch of money to take a test, did a class in the EPP, and then they're going to say, well, now you have to do more than this. That is so there has to be something to decrease the amount of what is expected for a new teacher. If not, we're going to continue to lose teachers, period.
Thank you. I really appreciate that perspective, and that I think definitely reinforces some of the thoughts around how do we really streamline some of this content given the STR content. Dominique, thoughts, questions, feedback?
Yeah, two thoughts. One, I think one of the themes around this is really our intent versus our impact. And I really would push us to really be thinking about that and problem solving from that perspective. The other thing I just want to add is we also have to be considerate of the additional burden that falls on our rural districts, because in urban districts, they typically have the training inside of the district. And so it can be built into, and I've seen this across our county because we help with that implementation, but we've seen it built into like PD days and different things that districts are able to do when they are the trainers, right? When they've been identified as the providers of the reading academies and they've built up staff and coaches who do that. However, with the staffing challenges that we're facing just writ large, that's going to be even harder to do. And our rural counties and rural districts have an additional burden that we need to consider in this respect. The last thing I'll say is I understand the Reading Academy's work to have been about the importance of teachers being able to support students in their journey to being readers, right? When we think about these 5 areas or these 5 certification areas, my push here, and kind of in keeping with some of what Liz said, is if we think about putting this in the preparation space, we actually have the opportunity to build some of these skills in every certification area. Because as a former middle school science teacher, I was still trying to teach kids how to read, right? And until we get to a critical mass of our students actually being reading on grade level, that's going to be the reality for most of our teachers, regardless of what they're teaching, regardless of what grades, what subject, etc. So I just, again, want us to think about intent versus impact here. I think the Reading Academies are a very valuable resource, but I agree with everyone who said it can be and has been for some of our teachers very burdensome, just in that they don't necessarily have the supports that they need, 1, to actually get it done, and 2, I'll be transparent. We did a survey too, kind of to Andrea's point, and this was a couple years ago now, but our survey yielded that our teachers came out of the Reading Academies with all of these new skills and abilities and went back to campuses and schools and school leaders who are not in support, for lack of better words, of what they were trying to execute from the Reading Academies, because those leaders had not been trained on this. And when they went in to do observations, what they were seeing was not what they were taught to be able to evaluate the teacher's performance. So I think we also have to elevate that in terms of what are those systems around the Reading Academies that need to be corrected and supported.
Thanks, Dominique. That's a really good push and would reinforce that the need for leadership alignment there too, and recognizing the requirement that school leaders also attend a version of Reading Academies too, but recognize with any implementation of a new requirement, there might be staggered training before we've got that like baseline understanding of best practice across the state. I know Carrie wanted to share too, and then I think we'll move on to the next question because I hear an eagerness to talk a little bit more on integration into EdPrep. But Carrie, thoughts, perspectives, feedback on your end?
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica. My raised hand isn't working, you guys. So I thank you, Jessica, for letting me sort of knock on the back door. First of all, I want to appreciate your bringing this to the agenda. I think it's really important. Likewise, we are hearing from our members that this is just an incredible burden, and not because the content isn't valuable, but just the way that it's being implemented is just not sustainable. Something that we talked about at the beginning, right when this legislation was passed, was the difference between the comprehensive and the blended models. And I think that what's happening, how things are unfolding at the district level is that mostly, due to funding and everything else, what's happening is that teachers are doing the blended model, and it's all self-directed, and it's especially burdensome on these new teachers who are trying to learn where the bathroom is, like one of our state board members was talking about, like so much going on. And I think that in critical to this piece, I fully agree that testing out is a smart option, that doing a crosswalk and removing some of the content. But then also teachers like really quality, high quality, comprehensive, coach embedded training opportunities that don't require a lot of their own private, graduate school coursework after hours, after the kids go to bed kind of thing. And so I want to just center the idea that maybe, pushing some element of this training later in their career when they're not still focusing on learning how to be a new teacher, and saving some of the money that could be, that would otherwise have been spent if we were trying to address all the competencies, saving that for higher quality coaching, job embedded, person to person, not virtual coaching models to train some of these reading competencies for teachers sort of later in their career. I think that could address retention. I think that that could address a lot of, learning opportunities and would be a much better way of spending our money. Thank you.
Carrie, thank you. Appreciate that feedback. We'll certainly take that back to the teams who more directly oversee the Reading Academy's work, but definitely think a valuable feedback to share. With that, I did want to transition to the second potential opportunity that we wanted to surface with this group to gather your feedback and input. And that's really about an opportunity for educator preparation programs to apply for approval as Reading Academy's authorized providers. And that would allow for EPPs to provide the full Reading Academy's training to candidates prior to their employment. I will name that this is already an option that is on the table for all Texas educator preparation programs. There is a windows in which entities can apply to become authorized providers, which just basically means you're able to deliver the Reading Academy's training for official completion. That is an opportunity that's on the table, but recognize that as we've implemented both the Science of Teaching reading exam requirement and the Reading Academies during similar timelines, we know our programs were deeply focused on updating their curriculum, updating their own requirements with an eye towards the Science of Teaching, preparing candidates for the Science of Teaching reading exam. And so we recognize that up till now, there are no EPPs that are approved as authorized providers of the Reading Academies. And really with this question, again, we're really just seeking to understand what questions, thoughts, feedback do folks have, and then transparently wanting to learn more what would need to be true for this to be something that could occur in educator preparation. So we are not in any way saying that this is a mandate that's coming down from on high tomorrow. We truly want to hear from you. What are the considerations? What are the pitfalls? What are the things that we need to keep in mind? What are the topics for further discussion to think about this opportunity potentially moving forward? So just want to name that up front. Liz, I know you had indicated some feedback that I think was more applicable to this slide earlier. So I want to circle back to you first and sort of give you an opportunity to name any other considerations. What would need to be true, Liz, from your perspective for this to potentially be a viable option, if you think it even could be?
So I think the question, and I'm currently texting with my reading faculty so that I can have some informed discussion with the board, with this group. The question is, would we have standards that we would need to meet that we could implement flexibly, it may be across several courses that already exist, or is it simply we're a provider of the existing curriculum? And so it's just, this would be added on top of what's already embedded in our curriculum.
That's a good question, Liz. So would there be opportunities for you all to leverage current coursework related to Reading Academies completion, or would we say no, we need to explicitly implement the direct Reading Academies per the authorized provider verification? That's a good question. I think definitely something for us to kind of continue to unpack together. Appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Christina, any other thoughts, reflections on your end here?
I just was curious, what is the steps for the EPP to become the provider of the Reading Academy?
Great question, and I am in no way an aficionado, but they do need to complete a pretty robust application process, and I don't want to speak out of turn, so I can certainly share back more information about this as a follow-up with the EPAC, and just so you all are fully aware. But I do know that really one of the core components is having, I forgot their official name, but essentially having folks who meet qualifications as essentially Reading Academy facilitator. So ensuring that you have folks within your organization who've got the requisite knowledge and skills to be able to effectively deliver the content of these trainings, effectively evaluate the artifacts that candidates submit throughout this process, et cetera. So, but I can definitely share back with you all the full requirements.
And that was actually what I was going to ask. Is it possible if like in a follow-up email, you could send like the out expectations?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Lisa, thoughts, perspectives from your end?
Yeah, I think from the EPP perspective, along with Liz's point, could it be used in other classes or what we have? But beyond that, the amount of hours, like, I don't know how to put that into a curriculum that pre-exists. And that is probably a 2-year process in higher ed. So
Exactly.
it is, I'm not saying we can't do it. I just don't know how to do it. And then as a public institution, I'm capped to my 120-hour degree. So I can't add courses. I don't know how to add 120 plus hours of time into a degree program. I'm just trying to think of the logistics. It would be very difficult if it couldn't be something done with existing courses where we say, check, 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 check. Here's the few modules we need to add. So I'm just trying to understand how we would even do that.
No,
I'm not saying no to it. I don't want to be like, I'm not saying no. I'm just trying to understand how that would be possible.
No, and those are all the exact things we want to start like unpacking together, right? Like, what could be all the barriers? What are all the real barriers? And think about, are there ways to work around them, or are they, this is just means that this isn't possible, right? So I think pulling folks together from this point on, if this sounds like something that folks are interested in, pulling folks together and kind of unpacking this further, I think would be a really great next step. So I appreciate you naming some of those kind of continued wonderings or things that we could maybe all thought partner together around. Dominique.
Similar to Rebecca's comment in the chat and what Lisa just shared, I'm coming from my former EPP leader hat, specifically an alt-cert EPP leader. Here's what I want to ask us to think about. I want us to think about the appropriate placement in terms of teachers having the opportunity to experience the reading academies and then practice, right? Because there is this necessary iterative process where they're learning some things, trying it out, that really grows them. And the research is clear on that. I know everybody on this call knows that. The second thing I would say is to the point about like existing courses and, the caps around hours and all of that, is there a way for us to think about, does it make sense for this particular training if we do something virtual, and this is just a suggestion, if we do it virtually, for it to live maybe in internship or in one of those periods of time in the candidate's coursework and experience that has a little bit more flexibility. And I say that loosely, given that Jamil is in a classroom every day trying to do this, right? And I recognize there are challenges there, but I'm just trying to push us to think about different ways to apply it as opposed to a one-size-fits-all model, because I think flexibility is going to absolutely be necessary. And if we don't cull down the content in some way, shape, or form, it might really be the barrier to us being able to make this valuable training accessible to all.
Awesome. Any other thoughts, perspectives, feedback here from the group? And just name, I really appreciate the feedback, the thought partnership here. I think that, this is just an initial conversation. Transparently, we recognize we had the opportunity to come together with the experts. And so wanted to really put these wonderings in front of you all as soon as possible, so that we could really kick off further collaboration and further thought partnership to think about ways to really address some of these really critical pieces of feedback that we've been hearing from the field. So this actually is a really nice segue into my next section of our meeting today. And just so want to name one, this is not the last time we'll talk about reading academies. And I should have anticipated in my internal notes, I said we'll probably spend about 25 minutes here, and we spent a good 40. And I anticipated that everyone loves to talk about the reading academies. But I wanted to name a structure that we are looking to potentially activate with this group moving forward, which is specifically the potential to implement what we would call EPAC working groups. So we know that this group tackles a lot of big, meaty areas of discussion that really necessitate some deep thought work and some deep opportunities for two-way conversation and collaboration. And then also recognize that folks have different areas of expertise or different areas of interest. And so I think we demonstrated with that topic around the reading academies that there's really some interest to dive deeper. I think Lisa sharing some of the considerations or things that folks might need to come together and put problems of practice on the table and grapple with together, I think could be a really good example of the type of work that an EPAC working group could engage in moving forward. And so wanted to name that when the EPAC was restructured, in its most recent restructure, Dr. Olafson had named that a potential process that could be leveraged in this restructuring, as we pulled in folks from educator preparation, from LEA systems, from community organizations, et cetera, was to potentially also develop working groups that could dive deeper into specific topics of interest. And so given that there's a number, I think every topic on today's agenda could have its own dedicated 4-hour plus meeting or an opportunity to really dig in and do some collaborative thought work. And so what we wanted to propose to this group was an opportunity for members of the EPAC to spend some more focused time on areas of interest and bring back recommendations to the broader committee. And so there is no end to the number of working groups that we could establish together, but I'll name, given the topics that are on the docket for discussion today, two that were top of mind for us, were the potential to have a working group particularly focused on the development of criteria and a process for an alternative performance assessment, and then also a working group more specifically focused on supporting some of the work related to the development of the effective preparation framework. So we will follow up today's meeting with a survey to solicit some feedback on this structure and then to garner some initial interest in participation in these initial proposed working groups. I'm sensing I'm also going to add a Reading Academies working group to that list, and then also to gather from you all if there's other potential working groups that you all think would be helpful for this committee to pull together and engage in more deeply. So just wanted to name that this is a structure that we'll be pursuing moving forward. But I did want to pause and just see if there's any reactions or thoughts from the committee around the development of these working group like structures. Liz, I see your hands raised.
You know me, I'm always going to have questions. So my initial thought is this is great. You know, the EPAC only right now meets 5 times a year and it's immediately after board meetings. But my question is, we're all very, very busy people. And would these working groups be limited to existing members of the EPAC, or could they be headed by members of EPAC and have additional people with expertise? Because again, as I've already mentioned, I'm interested in the reading academies from the EPP perspective, but I don't have the expertise. So what are your thoughts or initial comments related to that the EPAC working groups could have non-EPAC members?
That's a really good question, Liz. I think initially, I transparently would love to hear from other members of the EPAC, their thoughts around potentially pulling in other folks, or if it makes sense for us to just start with members of the EPAC. I see Rebecca in the comment named that she likes the idea of working groups, and Kevin shared that he's in and likes the idea, but want to get any other feedback on thoughts on working groups overall and thoughts on them, including just members of the EPAC or potentially pulling in other experts as needed.
Jessica, this is Holly. I didn't do I should have here.
There. You're okay, Holly, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I think, and also I think what would be particularly helpful in these working groups, for example, like if there is a Reading Academy one, to have the TEA folks who are, you know, heading that project up be part of that meeting, because, you know, we're talking about a segment of, at this point, a segment of the Reading Academies, or a piece of it for people who are taking the STR exam, but a lot of what we said is applicable to the broader audience. So, and there's a lot of questions, and so yes, it would be helpful to have TEA staff there as well.
That's a great idea, Holly. I think like pulling in other experts from within the agency where appropriate is definitely good feedback for sure. Christina, other thoughts on your end?
Well, I just had logistical questions.
Yeah.
So it like Liz did bring up, we only meet so many times. Like, have y'all thought about how many additional meetings you would want to add for this? Would they be like after or before these meetings so that they filter right in? And then kind of like a time frame of, okay, so if you are working on the effective preparation, like what do you want to have by this date, and this date to be able to move forward?
Absolutely. So I do think that some of the meetings of these working groups may be predicated exactly like you shared on sort of what is the deliverable, when do we need to be making a policy recommendation to the SBEC, et cetera, or is there something that this committee is working to help produce? So I think it may be dependent upon the specific committee that's engaged in the work. But I think that we would love to have an opportunity. I think in the survey, y'all are giving me great feedback on things to add to the survey, including sort of if you're interested in a committee, what would be your availability? Would it be one, 2 additional meetings, 2 additional meetings a year? Would you? I'll gather some additional feedback on sort of the parameters of folks' availability for these working group structures. But I do think we have something in the effective preparation section, effective preparation framework section of our meeting a little bit later. We've signaled that we'd love to leverage that working group to do some of the work of bringing coherence to the feedback that folks are gathering from their professional organizations. So that would be an example of like a specific timeline that we would want that working group to meet. But then depending upon the work from there could meet at sort of a different timeline. So I think it could depend upon the group itself. I'm seeing some good feedback in the chat. I think a trend in what I'm seeing is there an opportunity for us to meet first with just members of the EPAC, work out the kinks and the timelines, and then maybe pull in additional experts as needed. So I think that that's great feedback, but I'll also include that as an area for feedback in the survey. Andrea, additional thoughts or questions?
I'm sorry if I missed this, but did you explain how the membership of the working groups would be determined?
So great question. So our intent is to send a survey to solicit folks' interest in participating in the working groups. And I don't anticipate that we would have a cap on the number of folks who want to participate in a working group, but really this is dependent upon folks' interest and expertise. So if every member of the EPAC told me that they wanted to be part of the effective preparation framework working group, I would welcome all of our fabulous voices to participate in that structure. But just naming that we want to open up for areas for folks who want to spend a little bit more time digging into areas of interest.
Okay. I think for me, I'm a little bit skeptical of a cap because I wouldn't want anybody to be excluded from a discussion on something.
Exactly.
And not have that transparency of who was included.
Yep. No, 100% agree with you, Andrea. So we would not have a cap. Lisa, other questions from you?
Yep, mine's really just a quick one or comment. If we could, because we are all busy working folks and have lots of meetings and are happy to participate in additional things, and I like the idea of being able to dive deeper into topics. If we could find a way to know like when EPAC meetings really are, because like this one is keeping me from an all-day leadership meeting on campus, that because we moved it. If we could kind of hammer those down, then adding a few additional meetings for the working groups would be a lot easier. But with everything moving, it's just a little bit hard. So because I want to participate and I want to be an active member in the discussions. I want to hear the input. But if it's moving all the time, that might be difficult.
That's a really great piece of feedback, Lisa, and certainly, we've shared in our previous presentation sort of the timeline for the meetings for the year, and so we can continue to calendar those out, and we can also leverage this survey for all sorts of things. I think also getting some additional feedback from members of the EPAC around sort of the cadence of the meeting, the dates that we currently have slated that we have at the end of our presentation. Do those still feel right? Are there additional things we want to take into consideration in terms of timeline so that you all can just calendar out these EPAC meetings through the end of the calendar year, feel confident in those dates. And so then we know where to be able to work those working groups around them. So absolutely. And then Christina, just to name your question in the chat, I think our thought is you wouldn't just have to choose one. You could participate in as many as you would like to. Well, looks like you all have an exciting survey coming your way, and I'll be really, we really want this to be informed by the perspective and feedback of this group. And so we want to just make sure that we get your feedback moving forward and really start to leverage this exciting structure. With that, we are going to transition to one of those topics that, again, I think there would be incredibly well served by a working group to really dig in and do some of the heavy thought work. And that's specifically around an alternative performance assessment criteria discussion. We raised this with the EPAC at multiple of our discussions, but to name a little bit of where we are, staff did receive a directive from the board confirmed the directive from the board in December to move forward first with the implementation of the EdTPA, which is a performance assessment for certification, to replace the PPR, but to also codify a process to vet and approve additional performance assessment certification exams moving forward. This was discussed with the ESPEC during their February meeting. They dove a little bit deeper into some of the criteria and process around additional performance assessments. And Dr. Kelly really reinforced the importance of developing this alternative. And we continue to work with Dr. Kelly to further specify his expectations regarding this pathway. We'll name, in the interim, we still want to move the ball down the field with the development of criteria and a process for alternative performance assessments to the EdTPA. And I want to name, we shared with the ESPEC at the meeting in February that the development of a performance assessment is a nuanced and multifaceted process, and particularly if it's one that will be approved by the ESPEC, that there is a number of areas of criteria that the ESPEC needs to take into consideration when they are going to ultimately put a stamp on an educator certificate saying that they are ready to serve as a teacher of Texas students. And so we named for the board some of those initial areas that they should be keeping into consideration and establishing clear criteria around as we move forward in the process of ensuring we have a clear pathway for alternative performance assessments. And so thinking about criteria such as the structure, the content of the exam itself, we know one of the most critical factors is ensuring that any additional performance assessments maintain reliability and validity, that there's mechanisms for support for candidates and programs, there's opportunities for scalability, there's considerations related to cost, and then the rollout of the exam, including some of those structural considerations, IT supports, etc. So area that we've named for the ESPEC and have named that we will both be soliciting stakeholder feedback and the board's feedback as we move forward and propose criteria related to these concepts. That there's explicit opportunities for this continued discussion, both with this group and with the ESPEC. So at the April ESPEC meeting, there will be a discussion item specifically focused on alternative performance assessments. For the purpose of our work here together today, we wanted to begin the discussion with the EPAC and really garner your feedback and perspective around two critical areas of criteria that the board began a discussion around and named for us that they really wanted us to go out and seek additional stakeholder feedback. And that's specifically around the content of an alternative performance assessment. What are those stakes in the ground, those clear criteria we want when it comes to the content of this exam? And then ultimately clear criteria related to the structure of the exam itself. And so to make that a little bit more explicit, ultimately, we want to determine and have a clear set of criteria related to what do candidates need to demonstrate to signify that they are prepared for certification via this performance assessment. And then how can they best demonstrate that readiness? So in terms of the content, what do candidates need to demonstrate? And then in terms of the structure, how can candidates best demonstrate that? When we think about content, some examples I would give and some areas open for discussion are the extent of alignment to the educator standards, or are there prioritized educator standards that the exam needs to address? Does it need to have a focus on foundational pedagogical best practices? Does it need to represent relevant Texas classroom experience? Does it need to be subject specific? Does it need to reference certain grade levels, et cetera, in terms of the content itself? And then in terms of the structure of the performance assessment, would we expect for the performance assessment to include a portfolio? Would we ask for a series of artifacts in all performance assessments that are submitted? Would we require a video component in that portfolio? Would we require candidate reflection in that portfolio? Should the assessment be time bound, so a candidate needs to complete it within a certain period of time? Or could it be a collection of artifacts that a candidate gathers over the course of the entirety of their preparation program? We think that there's a number of considerations here. Is it a skills demonstration that's facilitated in a one-shot period in a given environment, et cetera? Number of thoughts related to structure as well. Here, what we'd love to do is leverage a few different engagement strategies to solicit your feedback. We first want to give folks an opportunity to independently reflect and identify some initial thoughts related to criteria for the content and structure of a performance assessment exam. Then what we're going to do is break into breakout groups, and we're going to ask in breakout groups for you all to look at what your fellow EPAC members shared, and identify any trends that you see among what's shared, any questions or wonderings. And then we'll bring folks back to the whole group to debrief any of the trends that we saw and discuss next steps. And I will name, there are no wrong answers. I am not a professional assessment designer. There are no wrong answers in this process. We want to hear from you and your perspective. Every voice on this committee is important. And we know that everyone has a perspective on what do candidates need to be able to demonstrate to know that they're ready for certification. And we know that all of you have really thought deeply in many of our previous discussions on how candidates could best demonstrate that. So no wrong answers. We're in an idea generative space so that we can really bring back some of your perspectives and feedback to the board.
Hi, Jessica, can I ask a question before we do this?
Absolutely.
I'm confused by sort of the interpretation of the directive, because based on Chair Kelly's language, it sounded to a number of stakeholders that the directive was to examine other ways to use a performance assessment and or other possibilities for an alternative PPR exam, like a certification exam, not that we were going to examine a criteria for determining another performance assessment certification exam. Like, I feel like his directive, well, I mean, in reading, his quotes, the directive was to consider alternatives much more broadly than to consider an alternative in this sort of narrow scope that these slides kind of represent.
So I appreciate that question, Carrie.
Disconnect there.
So I would name, maybe we can reclassify. I wouldn't name it's a disconnect. I would name that Dr. Kelly named that we need to consider alternative performance assessments. I think there has been an ongoing discussion among many members of the board who expressed that they would like to see that alternative be a certification exam. Dr. Kelly did open up that criteria. And so I think we could broaden our slide title to say alternative performance assessment options. So certainly if folks have perspectives on alternative performance assessments that would not be a certification exam, you all are welcome to share that feedback and perspective. Again, we will synthesize that ultimately, but we do need to, the board does have a statutory requirement to determine candidate readiness for certification. And so do want to name that, but we are, as I named at the start of this section, engage in ongoing discussions with Dr. Kelly to ensure that we've got real clarity related to his directive. But in the interim, want to continue this conversation with you all as members of the EPAC. So discussing alternatives to the EdTPA that are performance assessments. Yeah, and Christina, appreciate that framing, that he's interested in learning more about alternative performance assessments, and i.e. why we're bringing this discussion to this group. I think I see Holly and Lisa. Holly, any additional questions on your end before we jump into the activity?
Yes, I just wanted to, because, you know, I want to know whether what we should be looking at might differ based on the use of the exam. So for example, one of the alternative approaches that was presented, has been presented to the board, was to use a performance assessment as part of educator preparation curriculum, as opposed to a certification exam. And so if that is truly under consideration, then what we're looking at, would it differ? In other words, is the criteria for a high stakes certification exam going to be different than for one that's embedded in the curriculum and is not high stakes for that purpose? You see what I'm saying? So I'm just wondering if the criteria, the rigor and the stringency of what we talk about could differ based on how the test is used.
It's a good question, Holly. I would name that the focus on content and structure, I think, if ultimately aligns across potential use of performance assessment. Ultimately, we want to have a standard understanding of what our candidates need to demonstrate mastery of to be ready for certification. And ultimately, you know, I think you named that there are other alternatives at the local level that were presented to the board. Those would, you know, we want to ensure that there's clear stakes in the ground around what a structure would look like for a performance assessment moving forward. So I think in terms of content and structure, I don't think I would vary sort of the understanding of the level of rigor or demonstration based upon that. So that's really sort of our intent in focusing on these components, really starting with the end in mind of what we want to be true for candidates. But thank you for that clarification. Lisa, questions on your end?
Yes, thank you. Sorry. So we're only talking about performance-based assessments. I just want to be clear, that's the only option, not alternative types of assessments that might be out there that we could use. Is that right? That's what we're saying?
So for the purpose of our discussion here today, we're talking about alternative performance assessments.
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to understand, because I think there are other options, especially if you're thinking about something that's locally done in an EPP versus what's the certification exam, what that might look like. Okay, just wanted clarification for the purposes of today. We're just talking about performance-based assessments.
Correct. Andrea?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to echo what everybody else has said about Dr. Kelly, and maybe I need to reach out to him too and try and understand what he was actually saying at the board meeting. But my interpretation was that he was talking about, he said alternatives to EdTPA along the same timeline, and did specifically say that he wanted to see something like the Sam Houston model, which that's why I'm kind of having a confusion here too, is because I believed that their model incorporated the performance assessment within the curriculum, and then they did something else for certification that wasn't a performance assessment. So, but moving forward with this, so you said that we could change or think about the title of this slide being changed to just performance assessment and not thinking about a certification exam.
So I think
I just want to be sure that I understand what we're doing in the working group.
Mm-hmm. So I think we can think about this as a performance assessment. And I will name that Andrea, staff is working with Dr. Kelly to clarify his directive. So we'll certainly be able to share more in the future. Christina, other thoughts on your end?
Well, no, I just had a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So as far as our role as the EPAC, we are just bringing back ideas that we feel like would be beneficial under like how that content and how that structure is done. And that's what we're looking at right now, right? Like,
correct. So as an advisory committee, you all are sharing your perspectives and input on what could be some of that criteria related to the content and structure of a performance assessment.
okay, because yeah, and I mean, and I'm listening and kind of running through and all that good stuff. I also think it's kind of important for us to recognize one person doesn't make the board. And so it is great that we have people on the board who want to know different and learn about different things. I think it's just important that we remember, like, our goal here is to advise and to like think about what is going to be best for our educators. So like just moving in that direction.
Thanks, Christina. I appreciate that perspective. So certainly, you know, our goal is to be able to share information with the full board, and ultimately it's their determination. Again, we'll have that discussion item with the board in April to further solicit their feedback. So with that, I do want to turn it over to our activity. And again, the first step in this would be to engage in some initial independent reflection around these two big guiding questions. So what are our candidates, if they're engaging in demonstration via performance assessment, what do our candidates need to demonstrate to signify that they're prepared for certification, and how can they best demonstrate that readiness? And so we'll engage in an independent reflection to start, and I'm going to share a Padlet with you all in a second. I do see Christina and Kelby's hands raised. Christina, I don't know if your hand was still raised from earlier, if you had other, okay. And then Kelby, additional thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I was just going to name that, you know, having participated in these board meeting conversations, that I do think that there is confusion between how we're using terms right now. And so I do think that it will be helpful in these groups as you're proposing criteria to be really clear about, here's my perspective, here's what I'm proposing, here's like, when we propose, like, this is the content of what we'd like to see or in a performance-based assessment, but we want to see that as separate from the certification exam, and that the certification exam in this version is actually would remain the PPR, would be a PPR plus constructed response, or we just get rid of the certification exam. So like recognizing that, like, is your recommendation, and you know, individually or as you're discussing as a group, actually related to performance-based assessment, not as a certification exam, and therefore what is the certification exam, or is it as a certification exam, or do you have opinions about both pathways? And just getting really clear with both the board and as EPAC on what the recommendations are and how we're defining terms, so that the board can understand that. Because I think actually on the board, we just have confusion about what we're really talking about in these different areas. And are we talking about the certification exam, or are we talking about something else that actually requires a different set of changes?
Thanks, Kelby. And so I'm going to put in the chat for you. Appreciate Kelby's additional guidance there. We're going to continue to use, oh, thanks, Pam. She already put it in the chat. We're going to continue to use a Padlet. I'm going to stop sharing my slide deck for just a second and share with you all the Padlet screen. If folks are pulling into that document now. Doing that thing where you talk slowly so you can also pull up the other thing on the other screen. So here is our Padlet. For this purpose, we have, and I know that we've used a Padlet on a number of occasions together already, but just as a reminder, here we have a column related to content considerations. So that's a question of what candidates need to have demonstrated, and then a structure consideration. How should candidates best demonstrate their readiness? And so to add, and I put here in these green bullets some areas or things to take into consideration. But again, you can add a post A subject will pop up, and then you can type any additional content. And please, if you want to name, as Kelby shared, your perspective on whether it would be something local with a different certification exam requirement, or if it would be the certification exam, to add that clarification as well. So we will start. We're going to give folks about 7 minutes of time to independently reflect and share their perspectives via the Padlet, and then we will break into small groups to debrief what we're observing. Feel free, I'm going to set a timer. Feel free to turn your camera off while you're engaged in that deep thought work, and then we can circle back together as a group and just go into small groups in just a little bit. got about 1 minute left. If you've already shared your perspectives, if you want to start reading through what other folks have shared, so you'll be able to engage more readily in the small group conversation. I'm going to give folks about 30 more seconds to do a scan through of others' responses, and then we're going to send folks into small groups for a discussion of any trends that you saw in the comments themselves. So again, with those two key questions in mind, what do candidates need to demonstrate to signify they're prepared for certification, and how can they best demonstrate that readiness? So I'll give folks 30 more seconds to do a scan through and read. Then we'll send folks to small groups. All right, y'all. I knew this group was going to have some strong perspectives and some solid recommendations to share. And I appreciate that folks are even engaging with one another via the comments, via posts that people are leaving with comments and questions. So I anticipate we'll have some great discussion in our breakout rooms. What we're going to do is break this group up into different breakout rooms. We're going to randomly assign them. And then we will give you all about 12 minutes in that breakout room to discuss any trends that you observe. If you'll notice that there is a third column that says small group reflection, trends observed. And then we've got names for small groups 1 through 6, but I'm actually just going to break you up into 5 small groups. If your small group wants to make notes around your discussion by adding comments to your small group button or tab or post-it, whatever we want to call it, and then that will help us be able to synthesize more broadly trends. So if you can identify a note taker in your group who can add comments to your small group numbers post-it, then we can really help synthesize all of that good feedback. So I'm going to assign folks to breakout rooms now. You get to your breakout room, make sure that you have someone who's going to take on the role of note taker. And I would really reinforce in these breakout rooms, ensure that we're allowing for equity of voice. And we want to make sure that everyone's perspective in these spaces is heard and validated. So we'd ask that we continue to leverage our norms and leverage that equity of voice. So I'm going to send us into 5 breakout rooms, and then we will come back together and debrief. And I'll send a note of when we've got about 2 minutes left. Everyone, there we go. Welcome back from your breakout rooms. Please don't forget to, if you weren't on mute, to hit mute again as you come on back in. Well, I hope you had an opportunity for some rich discussion. Maybe got to connect with some folks who you may not normally have an opportunity to connect with in that personal way in our big committee. And so wanted to take an opportunity here to hear a little bit from each one of the groups. Appreciate everyone sharing some of the trends and that you all observed in the small group reflection comments, but wanted to turn it over to you all for a little bit of reflection. And then we are going to save all of this feedback as we move forward in future conversations with the FPAC. But I want to turn it over to each group to maybe share one trend that you observed as you were looking through some of the considerations, or the thing that was maybe an important consideration for your group. So I'll turn it over first to small group number 1. And this one, I have a non-anonymous commenter in small group 1. So Becky, do you want to share? I see that you were the one who typed the notes in there. Do you want to share a little bit of perspective on what your group discussed?
Sure, absolutely. Good morning. We were trying to just go on a pattern seeking mission as a group and really stamp what we were seeing in high frequency. And then I also have to give a lot of credit to my teammate, Dr. Sterling, who also named what she didn't see frequently. And so I would, what the comment that UC made about really being explicit about including the English language proficiency standards, that's sort of the conversation around that. And then on the structure side of things, in those comments, we actually were able to look at the trend about video. And then we were also really having a lot of rich discussion around the collecting artifacts over time and how we could learn from that process. So a very short summary of a very rich conversation.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate it. And group 2, any big takeaways or comments or thoughts from that group as you all were engaged in individual reflection and then summarizing trends?
Yeah, and group, I'm just going to weave in some of our the discussion, but we all agreed that the performance assessment, as far as from the content standpoint, needs to be aligned to core pedagogical tasks or core pedagogies, specifically around planning, facilitation of content and assessment. And then we noticed this sort of maybe like a not so much trend as far as like a focus on that, but then also talked a little bit about the idea of like time, like when these things happen isn't necessarily represented in the comments. And maybe that speaks to structure around the performance assessment. And then the last thing I'll offer is that we talked about the idea that a performance assessment is both standardized, so this valid, normed, reliable assessment that is sort of on the table here, but it's also formative. So what's happening within programs that ultimately support a candidate's ability to demonstrate proficiency on it.
Thanks, Calvin. Appreciate that framing. Knowing that the forms, the uses of performance assessment, I think that there's some good trends that we see in the comments. Small group number 3, perspectives or thoughts from that group.
So I'll go if nobody in the group wants to go. I thought something that was interesting that popped out early that Holly noted, and I definitely think this is backed up, is the big disagreement on the need and the need for videos. There are tons of issues that have already popped up and that continue to pop up, and then some folks are really behind it. So we thought that was interesting that there was a disagreement on that. Also, I think important, Holly mentioned this one as well, incorporating accommodations and modifications for all special populations, not just fed by English language learners, lots of different populations.
Thanks, Kevin. And then let's go to small group number 4. Any big trends that you all observed?
I'll speak with this one. As for content, it was important to us that the content was aligned to the T-tests, and that was because of the fact that teachers will be evaluated for the most part on the T-tests, and being able to use that continuously throughout their careers is really important. And it also provides some sense of, well, it provides the ability to use that data to look at the validity and the reliability of whatever assessment you're using to be able to connect back to that data. As for the structure, we really agreed that performance assessment is best used as a formative assessment, and talked about the importance of being able to have that assessment throughout a candidate's progression through their program. So having it be over a long period of time rather than in a short window. And we also agreed that video definitely does not work, especially in some communities where there are very vulnerable populations like kids in foster care. And it's also difficult to get a representative video of a candidate and be able to fully see everything that is going on. And along with alignment to the T-tests, very important that we are aligned to all of our Educator Texas standards, including a code of ethics.
Thanks, Andrea. And then our final group 5.
So I would say that basically our focus was on the T-test, that really should be the foundation, like other groups have said. Again, talked about the iterative process of being able to show growth in your ability to do all those foundational things: plan, assess, instruct, and absolutely needed to be adhered to the code of ethics. We did not talk about video, but I do know that that's a concern, and I think if we had gotten there, I think we would have agreed on that as well.
Thanks, Liz. So really, again, appreciate everyone taking the time to share your thoughts and perspective and engage in that rich discussion with your small group. Certainly, we will pull down and gather these trends and share some of this back with the board as they consider their criteria related to content and structure. In terms of next steps, I did want to highlight, again, reinforcing that this will be a discussion with the SBEC at their April meeting. And so there will be an opportunity for the board to further unpack both the concept of content and structure, as well as some of these other criteria that we've named here. We do plan on bringing this back to the EPAC for your further discussion at your May meeting. And I apologize, that's incorrect there on the side. It's actually scheduled for May 20th. May 21st is a Saturday. We didn't want to call you back on a Saturday. Liz, I see your hand raised. Did you have a final thought or question? Oh, you're muted, Liz.
Sorry, I put my hand down and thought I was unmuting myself.
Half the time I go to unmute and I accidentally leave a meeting. It happens all the time.
So I just, I know this wasn't the exact, the focus of the conversation, but Dr. Kelly's directive also mentions, looking for funding for the alternative pilot, and that it could run parallel to the current EdTPA timeline. Is it appropriate to discuss that right now, or will that be included in the item in April 29th?
That will be included as discussion within the item in April. Liz, we're still working with Dr. Kelly to get clarity around his directives and next steps.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you for clarifying that. Appreciate it. We will name though so again, we'll have opportunities again for the board to discuss this in April, to come back to you all as a committee in May. But we did want to name that we do think that this is a topic that would really benefit from a working group to provide some additional insight and feedback, et cetera. And so we do anticipate including this as an opportunity for participation, again, in that survey that I'm going to share as a follow-up. But again, really appreciate everyone's feedback today. I did want to name our final topic for today. I recognize looking at the clock that we are at 11:48 and our apologies, y'all. This is a really great example of why working groups would be really helpful, because we know that you all are busy people and we want to be able to dive deeply into these topics with you all. And we have two big areas of discussion that are happening simultaneously. And so want to just say thank you all for your rich discussion, and just want to name that we want to continue these discussions moving forward. The final topic on our agenda today is the effective preparation framework. And so we're really excited to continue this discussion with you all as members of the EPAC. We had a really great, a very short but good discussion with the SBEC at their February meeting related to the development of the effective preparation framework. So we wanted to share with you all a little bit about what the feedback that they provided, and then to reinforce and to review the action items and next steps that we discussed at our last EPAC meeting, and that we want to make sure everyone's got real clarity around directions, because we really want to make sure that that your voices are heard and leveraged extensively in the development of this effective preparation framework. So just a quick hit overview of the SBEC's discussion of the EPF in February. As you all know, it was a busy SBEC meeting in February. There was a lot of decisions that the board was making, and we got to the end of the day, and the board named that they wanted to talk through this quickly, but did name that they wanted to spend more dedicated time talking about this, because the board really reinforced that they see the importance and the value of the effective preparation framework and want to engage deeply in its development and want to really hear about the great work that stakeholder groups are leveraging to develop this framework. And so we do anticipate adding an update on the effective preparation framework development to each board meeting, so that the board has opportunity to hear more about the development, the work that you all are engaged in as the EPAC to develop and refine the effective preparation framework, the additional solicitation from other groups as we move forward. And again, just reinforcing that connection to the longer range feedback of the aspect related to the EPF development. At our previous meeting, we shared with you all that we would that we know that you all as members of the EPAC have expertise from the lens of educator preparation, from the lens of educator preparation policy, from the lens of K-12 instruction, from the lens of community groups that support our ed prep communities. And so we really want to leverage your expertise and the expertise of the organizations and the stakeholders that you represent and interact with in the development and refinement of the components of the framework. And so we shared with you all at our last meeting the draft that this committee had developed to date of components of the effective preparation framework. And we also shared some work that the Educator Preparation Regulatory Committee that was stood up by Educate Texas had developed initially for your consideration and reflection. And we asked for members of this committee to take that content out to your respective organizations and solicit feedback, and then bring that feedback back to this collective group for us to unpack it further and share recommendations on a refined, updated draft of the effective preparation framework. And so two things I want to name here. We've put together some pretty explicit directions in a Google Drive that I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and share the Google Drive so that we can orient to the content. And then we've also provided an updated timeline for folks, given when our next EPAC meeting is scheduled. It's scheduled for May 20th. And so we wanted to give folks ample time to engage in this stakeholder conversations with your respective organizations. So we're asking for folks to engage in this stakeholder feedback between now and April 21st, and to gather that feedback and then bring it back to the collective committee. And so I'm going to stop sharing for a second and then pull up the drive. So we will again share all of this as an outcome of today's meeting. But what you will see is what we've put together is a Google Drive folder that will be accessible to everyone. That includes a few key folders. One, we have the drafts of all of the committee's previous thought work and the initial draft summary of your components of high quality ed prep. We did share with you all, just for your reference, the work that the Educator Preparation Regulatory Committee had developed related to some recommendations around components of curriculum, progress management, and training and support. Just for context as well, because we use some nomenclature related to things like prioritized levers, essential actions, we wanted to share was a copy of the Effective Schools Framework so that you all could see and you could share with your stakeholder groups what an analogous framework could look and sound like just from an organizational perspective. And then what we've done is we've created a folder that says EPAC or EPF feedback. And we would ask that you, as you collect feedback from your organization, to create a folder for your organization, or you can even call it a folder with just your name, and to upload the resources or documents that you gather into that folder so that we can then synthesize all the brilliant ideas from your respective organizations. And then finally, I appreciate Liz shared feedback with staff that there's a ton of excellent research out there and work that strong organizations have been developing around that could be really useful to inform our work in the development of an effective preparation framework. So as you all have relevant resources, tools, et cetera, that you would like to share, not only with your own professional organizations, but potentially with the broader organization, please feel free to drag and drop it into this folder. Then it's accessible for everyone to have a reference and look at as they're talking with their professional organizations. One thing I did note is I put a version of an EPF overview deck in this folder so that as you're engaging your professional organizations or other stakeholders that you work with closely, you have sort of a common set of slides that you could work with just to introduce them to what the heck we're talking about when we're talking about an effective preparation framework. So overall, that's just wanted to orient you towards the resources here. And then we put together a comprehensive directions document with just some suggestions around some next steps. So orienting you towards the folder, and then the steps for actually leveraging these tools to solicit feedback, and then summarizing the feedback, and then popping that into the folder. And then we did include the timeline here for everyone's review as well. So just wanted a one-stop shop for you all with all the relevant resources related to this ask around soliciting feedback from your professional organizations. And we've given some recommendations on different ways to potentially approach soliciting that feedback. So as we wrap up today, that was really kind of just the stamping, reinforcing our opportunity to gather feedback from you all. The development timeline, we are still maintaining a focus on that development timeline and really aiming to hit those key milestones as we work together collectively to develop the effective preparation framework. And then finally, want to reinforce again, the working groups. We would really love to leverage an effective preparation framework working group, particularly to support in many functions, but one of them being once we gather all this really great feedback across your professional organizations or stakeholder groups, having that working group help synthesize some of that feedback as we then create the next draft of an effective preparation framework. And so again, we will include an ask for participation in that committee in the survey that we will share as a follow-up. In terms of additional reminders, we do have, Lisa, I appreciate your feedback earlier, we do have codified the EPAC meeting dates through the end of the calendar year. So again, we are aiming towards that next EPAC date of May 20th. Mark your calendar, it's a Friday, not a Saturday. And then we have another meeting in August and another in October. So mark your calendars for those now, and we will ensure that we can develop our working group meetings in a manner that works around those core group meetings themselves. With that, apologize y'all that we've had such a packed agenda. I appreciate those who sent their questions in advance. Hopefully we were able to fully address your questions and had some good opportunity to pose questions throughout the meeting today. Though a name, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to share them via email with members of staff, and we'll certainly aim to answer those and share any. I've got a number of things that are next steps to share out with you all as follow-ups, including some information about reading academies and that survey. So also happy to answer any additional questions for this committee in follow-ups as well. But wanted to thank you all so much for your time today. Again, I just really continue to appreciate the deep engagement and investment of this group in the work and look forward to continued collaboration. So thanks y'all. Have a good Friday and stay warm.
Jessica, real quick.
Yeah, Holly.
I think October 15th is a Saturday.
Oh, thanks, Holly. I didn't catch all the
is.
Saturdays then. Are you y'all sure you don't want to meet on Saturdays instead? Kidding. All right, we will make sure we update those dates for you, and we'll send that out in my follow-up too. Thanks, y'all.